Great. So I'm here today with Salima Namusobya, a renowned human rights professional who, alongside her role as Executive Director of the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, or ISER Uganda, is an expert in human rights law and forced migration, and is also an expert member of the Working Group on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. She was part of the secretariat that supported the development of the Abidjan Principles on the Right to Education, which is a definitive reference text on the right to education adopted in 2019. And she's one of the voices leading the charge against commercialisation of education in Uganda and beyond. So Salima, welcome. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Anna.
I wondered if we could start by talking a little bit about you. So before your role at ISER, your work had a greater focus on forced migration and refugees. And I know that ISER takes quite a holistic approach to economic and social rights. So I wondered how the issue of migration and economic and social rights intertwines for you.
That's quite interesting because actually the founding of ISER was partly informed by the socioeconomic deprivations of forced migrants. Having being a practitioner interacting with forced migrants on a day-to-day basis, I kept experiencing these deprivations, including in education, but also other aspects like health, for example, that the refugees, internally displaced persons were facing. And this is part of the reason why I was more curious to look more into social and economic rights, because yes, much as Uganda was, for example, very welcoming to refugees, but various aspects of their social and economic lives were wanting. And when you tried to engage with policymakers around forced migrants and their social and economic rights, the response would always be, you know, even nationals do not get some of these things. How do you expect us to give better treatment to the refugees? So the two are really, really very connected, because when forced migrants get uprooted from their home countries or from their homes, if in the case of internally displaced persons, part of what they require most are these basic needs: health, education, and it is always something that is not obvious depending on where they find themselves.
That's really interesting. And interesting that it's difficult to advocate for those rights for these populations in comparison to kind of wider populations. So focusing, I guess, specifically on the right to education, because that's an area that our respective organisations both share. What are the kind of greatest risks and opportunities with regards to the right to education of migrant populations, in your opinion?
And now I think the greatest risk I see for the refugees especially is continuity of their education, because many times they come from a different system, and depending on where they go, whether the country chooses a camp setting or they are integrated, continuity is not always obvious for them. You first of all have to understand the system, see where you fit in. And for many of them also, there's a language barrier that sometimes stops the refugees from fitting in very well. But also, depending on the arrangements, the quality of the education that they end up getting is sometimes less than what maybe the nationals are exposed to. But there are those who sometimes do get some opportunities. There are some scholarships that have been ring-fenced for refugees in certain settings, so higher education scholarships, but also people who are in adult education, for example, who would want to take on adult education. I think it is more well received among migrant populations as opposed to the locals in a particular area. People do not frown upon a forced migrant who's seeking to engage in adult education. So in that sense, I think that there's more opportunity for people who may not sometimes have had formal education in their countries to come and try and build up themselves in that regard. So yeah, but I think in many cases, the risks are greater because yes, many times there is a cost that is attached to it, but especially fitting into where somebody was. And for many children, if they are taking you many classes back, it is a disincentive, and some of them may have to drop out. But also the quality in terms of the emergency situations, and people find themselves, you know, in less than conducive learning environments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I imagine that sometimes you have linguistic barriers as well as you say, different educational systems in different levels. But it's very interesting that adult education could be an area to explore more in terms of further in adult education as a potential opportunity for forced migrant populations.
Sure, and for language, it's really a serious issue, because if I will give you an example of the refugees, for example, that come to Uganda, many of them will be Congolese from the Democratic Republic of Congo. They are Francophone. Uganda is Anglophone. And some of them are South Sudanese. They've been studying in the Arabic system and they find themselves in Uganda. So there is a lot of adjustment and catching up to do. Many times UNHCR tries to ensure that they continue learning in French, but it's not usually the same, especially when at the same time, the country is saying, you know, there has to be integration between the refugees and the host communities. So that means you have to enter the ordinary system that you've found around. So you have to find your way, but also the urban refugees, it's almost non-existent that you find any arrangements for special education for for urban refugees. So they have to get into the ordinary national system, which is English speaking system. So they have to adjust from what they know and start by learning English, and then they get integrated into the school system.
Okay. So moving on, I guess, a little bit to the issue of privatisation in Uganda, which I know is something that you are one of the kind of leading voices on within Uganda, but also in terms of externally looking at the regulation of private actors in education, and obviously your role as one of the people who supported the development of the Abidjan Principles. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about privatisation in Uganda and whether that, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, that still represents one of the greatest issues the nation faces, or whether perhaps there are other issues that have superseded it in terms of importance.
I wouldn't say, and I wouldn't really rank issues in terms of importance and the way they impact on the right to education, because issues impact on each other. I wouldn't say one works like this and the other works like this. So if for me, the two things I still see impacting the right to education, on the one hand, from the government side, is the underfinancing, under-resourcing of the public education system. And when I talk about issues impacting on each other, the liberalization, privatization of education has an impact on that, because the fact that more private schools came up and enrollment has gone up has kind of led the government to relinquish its responsibility for adequately resourcing the public sector, partly because many people with, for lack of a better word, agency to speak up when things are not working well, have migrated to the private system. And the people who are left in the public system are the more poor people in society, and with less capacity to influence things like financing. So you find that there's a problem there, but also with COVID-19, the wider inequality that we see manifesting at this point in time was partly driven by privatization, the more resourced private schools that continued schooling while the rest of the children who are going to public schools and low-fee private schools were not going to school. So the widening inequality, the use of technology, many of the big private schools adjusted very fast. And you see that right now they've left the other children so far behind that catching up is difficult. And much as the government says they are recognizing the inequality that has resulted from education, you do not see it in practice, because they have, for example, said, okay, those children who are, I don't know how I would explain this to you, who are in like primary 5, when COVID started in 2020, can now sit for exams this year. They are supposed to have been in P7, but that is only children who are able to continue with their schooling. And these were children who are using technology, doing Zoom classes, doing Google classes, but no child has that advantage if they were in a rural area, for example, or they come from a poor family. So already their counterparts who are from well-to-do families have left them by a year. But also we are waiting to see if the setting of exams is going to consider this fact, because there is a significant disparity that has been created among the children who are able to go to school during COVID and those who are at home for 2 years. And this is an issue of privatization, but also the fact, the cost being driven up during this time after COVID-19 is also an issue that you can attribute to privatization, because, for example, at the secondary level, the percentage of private schools is quite high at 66%. And so they dictate a lot of what happens in the market. So the prices they set, the standards that they would want to set, is what many people are going to follow. So the cost of education has gone up significantly because partly the government does not have control over these private actors. So I would really say privatization is still an issue that is impacting the right to education up to now.
And I take your point, and I think I agree that actually separating issues isn't always necessarily helpful. And as you've described, there's kind of an intersection of privatization and connectivity issues and socioeconomic issues that all interact to place people, some children in particularly kind of vulnerable situations with regards to their education. And are many children still out of school due to school closures, or have public and private schools alike reopened again now?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I wondered whether there are still children who are out of schooling at the moment in terms of school closures, or whether all schools have more or less opened, or what the current situation is in Uganda.
Definitely, there are many children out of school. Right now, we are not able to put a number because assessments are still ongoing, but our National Planning Authority had anticipated 30% of children not being able to go back. So a number of them are out, either because of cost of education, or for the girl children, because many of them were married off, or they got pregnant and may not be able to enroll back into school immediately. But also there are many children who got engaged in the workforce. Precarious labor situations, but also some children who got introduced to money and they simply have not returned to school. So there's a significant population right now from rapid assessments that we've done as ISER. Many schools have told us that their children have not returned. I don't have the statistics off my head, but we have them documented. So it is something that needs to be worked upon, because it is definitely going to become protracted unless the government and other stakeholders become intentional about getting these children back into school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very difficult panorama that you describe. I suppose leading on from that then, when it comes to the right to education, I wondered what kind of suggestions or solutions or proposals you would make to improve the right to education in Uganda or kind of more broadly.
My number one suggestion would be adequately resourcing the public sector to have good quality public schools, both at primary and the secondary levels. And what we saw from COVID, there has been a significant migration of children out of private schools going into the public schools. So right now, many public schools are overcrowded. They have limited infrastructure, limited teachers, because they are handling more than they could. And these children moved out of the private schools because one, for many of them, majority, the cost of those private schools, but two, because especially the low fee schools that were dependent on the money that was coming in order to survive, did not survive the COVID period. So many of them closed. So some children found their neighborhood schools closed and they had to find a public alternative. So right now, I think it should be the priority for government and all development partners to ensure that these schools have the capacity and are delivering the quality that is suitable to realize the right to education. For me, that would be the priority. And then secondly, it is to ensure school retention for all children. There is a high dropout rate, either due to child labor, early marriages. There are several socioeconomic conditions that push children out of school, especially the girl child, that need to be paid attention to, and government should be able to work with various stakeholders in order to be able to bring back the children to school. If you speak of the private sector, I think we should get to a position where the private sector is only playing a complementary role to the government system, and people should be able to choose private schools only if it is voluntary and out of choice, and they are looking for something exclusive, not being forced because either there is no government alternative in their vicinity, or being forced because the quality in the government is not sufficient. So there has to be a highly regulated space for private players to be able to just play that complementary role that adds to the right to education, as opposed to the situation we are in at the moment, where the private sector seems to be driving the education field generally.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And I wondered, sort of going back into your own past, because I think so much of what shapes us happens to us in our school years. I wondered if there's any kind of notable memories from your own schooling, or stories or individuals that have had an impact on you and your education and your kind of choice of career and decision to pursue rights and the right to education, among other rights, in your professional life. Do you have any kind of stories of that kind you'd like to share?
Wow, about schooling, I think for me, with regard to education, I see it as that right that is really transformative. And from personal experience in my primary school, I went to a public school at primary level, and at secondary level, I went to a government grant aided school, which is mostly supported by the government, and they were affordable. And getting into university, you would find that you have children from all backgrounds, there were colleagues who we met at university, and they will tell you they are coming to Kampala, the capital city, for the first time, simply because they went through the public schooling system and they've passed and they've been able to access the university. They are coming to the city because of education. And from there, they've been able to get jobs and be able to help their siblings and their families back home. And it has really changed their situation. In our years growing up, it was rare to find people who've gone to private schools purely, especially for people who did not grow up in Kampala like myself. It was in Kampala where you mostly had some private schools to talk about, but these were schools that were serving the really middle class people, and you did not have many private schools. So to see a situation at the moment where a child from a less privileged background is able, for example, to study at primary level and get the necessary grades to get into a government grant-aided school at secondary level, and is not able to get in simply because of cost, it is really disheartening for me, because for many of my colleagues and myself, we are a product of that public system, and it has worked for us, and we've really seen lives changed because of that. So, which is why I really feel passionate about education, because I know and I have experiences of what it can do for people. And to see somebody deprived simply because of who they are or where they come from, because they cannot afford an education, is simply unacceptable. And that is partly why I do the work that I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really powerful way of describing it, but also highlighting the role that education has as really as an equalizer, right, that enables people to engage with so many of their other rights throughout their lifespan. With regards to your role at the African Commission on People and Human Rights, then is education something, a big focus of your work in that particular arena? And I suppose, what is your view of the role of institutions like the African Commission?
Yes, so I serve as an independent expert member of the African Commission Working Group on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, that working group has a wide mandate, as you hear, economic, social, and cultural rights. And it engages the working group. What we do as experts is, first of all, to propose policy norms development to the Commission, but also to implement Commission resolutions, for example, around specific thematic areas like education. At the moment, for example, we are involved with drafting a general comment on the state's obligations to regulate private providers engaged in service delivery, and we are focusing mostly on health and education. So that general comment is supposed to provide guidance to states. It's an authoritative interpretation of the African Charter that is supposed to provide guidance to states on how to regulate private actors engaged in social service delivery. So education is a big part of our focus, because what informed the resolution 224 that initially in that resolution, that is where the Commission expressed its concern around privatization in health and education, and the fact that they are negatively impacting the right to health and the right to education. So the evidence that was being used was evidence that had been collected mostly around the right to education by various civil society actors, but also by the commission itself when it interacts with the state through the state reporting mechanism. So that evidence on education and privatization informed that general comment. And right now, the commission is calling for public comments about the draft that has been done. And we are hoping later in the month to discuss those comments that are coming from the public before the general comment can be finalized. So we engage in such work, but also reviewing, for example, policies that may be coming out of the African Union as it relates to the right to education or the right to health, depending on what social and economic rights it is. But we also conduct studies and researches around various thematic areas related to economic, social, and cultural rights. So it's a whole wide mandate, but definitely education is a part of the rights that we do monitor and advise around through the work of the working group.
Fantastic, and we will share the call for inputs as well along with this video so that people can feed in their perspectives. We are coming to the end and I'm conscious of time, but I wondered, having discussed a lot of the challenges and the challenges that existed before and now post-COVID, I wondered if we could finish on a kind of note of positivity, should there be one. So I wondered if there's anything that has inspired you or given you a sense of hope over the last few months.
Yeah, certainly there is some positive developments regarding the right to education in Uganda in the last few months. And for me, the biggest one is that the country is at a point where we have recognized that there is need to revise our education white paper and rethink the policy direction that the country has taken with regard to education implementation. So the government recently, the Minister for Education recently appointed Education Policy Review Commission that is currently collecting views from the public to inform the revision of the education white paper, which was last done in 1992. But the existence of that commission alone shows that there is realization that there is actually something wrong with our system and we need to go back to the drawing board, which is a positive note, because for any change to be done, you have to first start by acknowledging that something needs to change. So it's really positive. And secondly, there has also been significant investment in construction of new seed schools, public schools, especially at the secondary level. So in the coming years, there's going to be more public schools at secondary level, which is something very positive in terms of checking the privatization in education, because the secondary level was the most was impacted most by privatization because there were less government schools, which is why in the first place government had entered into public-private partnerships, because they felt they did not have enough secondary schools belonging to the government that would implement the universal secondary education. But again, implementation of the public-private partnerships wasn't very positive. Many studies, including a study by ourselves as ISER, showed that actually the PPPs were doing more harm than good. So the government phased out that project of public-private partnerships, and now they are embarking on building more construction of more seed schools at the secondary level. So hopefully we are going to have ownership of schools roll back a bit from the 66% private at the moment as it is now. And of course, lastly, maybe on a positive note, again, there's a move by government to come up with a policy on private involvement in education to try and regulate private involvement in education, again, coming from the recognition that there has been unregulated private growth in the sector, and it is doing more harm than it was envisaged. So there is need to rethink what it is that the government wants to do in terms of letting private actors in education. So yeah, it's not all doom and gloom, but yeah, there's some pointers in the right direction. And also post-COVID, there has been recognition that pregnant girls need to get back into school. Yes, there is still some struggles because some, for example, religious groups do not believe in that, but at least the indications from government are that pregnant girls can get back to school, and also breastfeeding mothers can be able to attend schools. So implementation is still challenging, and definitely it varies from one corner of the country to another and one school to another. But definitely that is also, we've moved a bit from where we were, where people are like, you're pregnant, you automatically get out of school.
No, there's definitely steps in the right direction. Although, as you say, I'm sure there's implementation challenges, but yeah, really positive to hear that there's such positive developments, and hope that the construction of schools leads to greater public ownership of schooling in the nation. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been lovely talking to you. And yeah, thank you very much for such an interesting discussion.
Thank you too.
Thank you.